My name is Flowers Luna. Um, and welcome to the ABC Quick Check presentation at Morton Grove Library. This is an introduction for preparing your bicycle for safe riding. And I was getting my kid ready so they can stay busy while I was doing this. And she was like, "What are you going to be talking about to all these people?" And I said, "Oh, I should probably explain it to you. And then that'll sort of get me, all ready to go." And I basically said, this is a presentation where someone has to have a bicycle. And on this bicycle, they're going to be able to decide on their own, is this ready for me to take this out on the road, or do I need to have a bike technician look for it? And they're like, "Oh, that's a great idea." So a 9-year-old approves of this presentation, and we'll go from there. So welcome, everyone. A little bit about me. My name is Flowers Luna. I currently am a small business owner of a bike shop in Southwest Evanston. So I'm not too far from the library. And the bike shop is about 2 years old. We're very small. It's just me. Well, I should say it's me and my spouse. My spouse does all my internet marketing, money stuff, and I'm in the shop all the time. So if you ever make your way to Luna Alley Bike Shop, you'll be talking to me on the phone or emailing with me for the foreseeable future. For 17 years, I worked in social services. This was working in nonprofits that were mostly working with young people. I worked at a nonprofit working with runaway and homeless youth. I worked at a nonprofit bike shop in Rogers Park. And I also worked at a social emotional learning program here in Evanston for after school youth for the public school system here, D65. And a lot of that work fueled kind of and informed me what I wanted to do with this bike shop. And right now, most of the stuff I do is labor oriented, but eventually I'd like to create something that is a little bit more for young people and programming for young people to be able to work on their own bicycles. And I also have taught bike mechanics, extensive bike mechanic classes. There is a nonprofit bike shop in Rogers Park called The Recyclery. They've been around since 2005, 2006. I started with them shortly after they began. And there I created a curriculum in English and Spanish, where I taught, it's called the Complete Overhaul class. And basically folks completely take their bicycle apart. And every week you put a new piece back on. So we start with bearing systems, you learn how to true your wheels, adjust your hubs, adjust your bottom bracket, adjust your head to, so really the whole thing. I think they're still teaching that class. So it's a really cool way to kind of learn a little bit more about your bicycle. Yeah, let's see. Oh, and as Bob mentioned, if you have questions, you can either unmute yourself, throw something in the chat. Bob's going to have his eye on the chat and he might bring it up. If it's something that can wait, we might wait to do it at the very end, but I'm all for the flow of letting questions come as they go, okay? So the purpose of this presentation really is to ensure a safe ride before you get on a bicycle. What we want to do is, if you're someone that has a bicycle, whether it's yours or not, you come across this bicycle and you're able to decide, is this ready for me to go? There's three main systems that you're able to check during, after this presentation, that you can see if this bicycle is going to be ready for you. First thing and foremost, and I would say the first two are kind of equally important, but you can't ride a bicycle the wheels and the tires don't hold air, you know? So you'll be able to do that. You'll be able to decide that. And then eventually, or just as important, is making sure that the bicycle stops. It's more important that the bicycle stops than goes, right? Because if you can't stop a bicycle, it's not safe for you. And then the third one is how well does my bicycle, move and change gears if it has gears. So you'll be able to deduce if the bicycles needs maintenance and repair from a bicycle maintenance technician as well. So if you get to a point and you say, okay, my bicycle's holding air, but I'm at a point now where I can't decide if this is broken or not, if this is rust or not, if this is malfunctioning or not. So you'll be able to decide, does this need to go to someone else that can take this apart or replace this? You're going to familiarize yourself with these main systems um, that are used during a ride. I started doing bicycle mechanics in my college dorm room around 2004. A friend gave me a bicycle, and before this point, I really, and this is kind of with anything, right? Like if you're not familiar with it, you sort of assume this is rocket science. Like this is not for me. How do I do this? And really, my friend, she was just like, I didn't have a bike stand or, to be able to put it up on a stand to do work on it. She was like, just sit down if you can, or some people flip the bike upside down. You can do that if that's what you need to do, but just sit down and have the parts in your face, have them in your face, touch them and see what they are. Chances are, what each one is doing when you're riding your bicycle. It's just that a bicycle is usually like on the floor or we're on top of it, right? And we aren't able like to see it right in front of us. So if you just like are able to have it right in front of your face and right in front of your hands, that kind of just like, demystifies sort of like that idea of like, this isn't for me, this is too hard, I don't know what's happening to my bike. I have in my policy book for my bike shop, the first policy is that my clients are experts and they might not know what something's called, but when they come in, I ask them a ton of questions and like I want to treat them like they know what's happening. And so they've been riding the bicycle, they own it, they've had it for so many years, and they can use whatever words they want. So I want them to be able to be familiar with whatever it is. I can give them the lingo and the jargon, but I want them to be able to say, I know what's happening. It's a sound, it's a vibration, it's a looseness, whatever. I take all those words in. I've been doing this for so long. I've heard that a wheel can be wobbly, broken, noodly, all these other words. So I love all the descriptions people have. And when I say it to you, it all makes sense, right? So that's one thing that I really like to do with my clients. And I also want this presentation, as brief as it is, to set a foundation for bicycle maintenance and repair. Like once you understand these three systems and how you're in charge of all of these when you're riding your bicycle or when it's right in front of you, if you decide to take a wrench to it, I want this to sort of like be a foundation for doing more things later. Whether you have, having the right tools for the job is really nice. It makes the job a lot easier, more precision. But you can true wheels. I've seen people true wheels where you align the wheel and make sure that it's radially and laterally aligned while it's on their bicycle. All it is having like a bracket that measures how much the rim is moving over. So, it's very accessible. And if you don't have the tools to do it, that's okay. I just want this to sort of be a point where you can sort of launch into that love of understanding your bicycle a little bit more. Any questions so far? Okay. As you can see, the list is really short. I think almost everyone here has at least one of these things. I have a picture of it up here. The other ones, maybe not, but so you'll need a bicycle. And if it's a bicycle that you've never seen or someone just gave you, and you know very little about, that's still okay. You can still run these checks with that kind of bicycle, but there are some basics of what it needs to have. It needs to have two wheels, right? If you have a frame sitting in your garage and maybe the wheels are somewhere else because you took them off and you pop them back on, that's okay too. But just make sure that you have two wheels that you know at some point belonged to this bicycle, or that you can, if you're able to pop them on your bicycle, that these wheels belong to that. Um, I don't know if anybody here would ever ride a fixed gear or track bike, but those bicycles usually don't have hand brakes or brake levers. But make sure that your bicycle has, brakes, um, brake levers, a saddle, um, and then really, if you can make sure that those things are on there, from here, running this check will make you, running these checks for these systems will help you make sure that you have the right cables, the right housing, the right brake pads, the right, valve that goes on, that's part of your inner tube. So you have to start off with a bicycle. Um, and I mentioned that because one time I was teaching a class and someone came to class without a bicycle and they really thought that they were going to get a bicycle. And oh, you know what? I probably should have made that clear. So anytime I do presentations like this, you got to have a bicycle to work on your bike. The next thing is a floor pump. A lot of folks have mini hand pumps, which are great. I just think they require a lot of effort to be able to pump enough air in there, and they're usually kind of like complicated to maneuver. So if you can have a floor pump, or somewhere where you can go use, a lot of bike shops sometimes have a hose coming out of their shop, so you can use that hose to put pressure in your air, pump some pressure into your air, into your tires. You can do that too, but if you have a floor pump, that's usually the best way to go. A sturdy rag. A lot of times, like, bikes get really dusty or grimy or dirty, and having that rag to remove old grease or dust and dirt from your chain, or from the cogs in the rear, or the chain wheels in the in the front, is really helpful. If I don't know, you don't see it on here, but I try to use, I try not to use too many solvents that leave a degreasing agent behind, because bicycles love grease, and there's a caveat to that, but I'll explain it later. But if you're using a degreaser or anything to kind of clean your chain or clean your rims or anything like that, a degreasing agent usually stays behind for a while afterwards. So if you were to like use a degreaser for your chain, a heavy duty degreaser, and then re-grease it, that oil relube it, that oil will kind of like dissipate pretty quickly. So I just use elbow grease, just when you're wiping things down and you have a sturdy rag, if you go at it for a while, that stuff will come right off. Sometimes you'll need like some sort of picking tool to take some deeper, cakes of grease or soot off, but sometimes just a rag will do. Cutting a piece of an old towel off, or a t-shirt or anything like that will help. Or a narrow, soft bristle brush, so an old toothbrush. These things are amazing. I have a ton of them in the shop. They really just get the job done. Since they're so small, you can really get them into parts of the bicycle that you normally can't reach. And you'll find that they're really super helpful. Try not to use anything that's too harsh. So try not to use like brass brushes or like steel wool. That stuff is helpful sometimes. I just feel like it doesn't quite, I don't know, I just feel like it doesn't quite do the job as well as I want it to. And sometimes it like damages some components or stuff like that. So I would just stick to like rags, something that's soft, or something like a soft toothbrush. Some optional things here are Allen or hex key wrenches. You'll find that a lot of the bolts and nuts are usually 4, 5, or 6 millimeter. There's something called a Y hex key, where it's just those three sizes on one tool in the shape of a Y. And that really helps a long way. But if you're not making any big movements like that, I put this in the optional section. And then open or box wrenches, something that would also substitute for that is an adjustable wrench. I will say that if you're using an adjustable wrench, there's always one part of an adjustable wrench that is moving or adjustable. Make sure that when you're using an adjustable wrench, that adjustable part is, because if you go like this, it's over here. If you go like this, it's over here. That adjustable section of the wrench is going in the direction you're turning. So if you're loosening something and you're going to go, in some cases, some things do go counterclockwise or lefty-loosey, you want to make sure that that adjustable end is going in the direction that you're loosening, because the force will cause it to open if you use it the other way, and that causes, stripped parts of nuts and bolts. So if you're going to use adjustable and not open or box wrenches, make sure that you're using that properly. Any questions so far about things that you might need for your bicycle? I figured I'm just going to ask at the end of every page here. All right, so it's called ABC Quick Check for a reason. We're going to talk about the A, we're going to talk about the B, the C, the quick, and the check. And it also is nice. It's like a big entry level, mechanic understanding for your bicycle. So A is for air. Anything that has to do with air, we want to make sure that it's in the right place. Air is more important than you think. Having too little air can cause flats in your inner tube. They're called pinch flats. And having a lot of air can oftentimes wear a tire or a sidewall in a certain way that causes inner tubes to bulge out. That one's a little bit more rare, but it also makes a ride really, really stiff. And certain tires aren't meant to have a certain amount of pressure. So air is really important. Anytime I go for a ride, and not everybody can have this, but I have a pump. I have several pumps in my shop. I also have some in my home. So when I'm taking my bicycle out, I check the air every single time. And I want to make sure that pressure is the same all the time. So first thing you want to do when you have this bicycle that has wheels, right? Everybody, you have wheels on your bicycle, is to check the sidewall of the tire. You want to ensure that this sidewall is in good condition, and some sidewalls are brown, some are black, some have writing, but you want to make sure that it's in good condition and not deteriorating. That usually looks like lots of cracks on the sidewall, and it's usually the first thing to go, like even more so than where the tire runs and wears normally when you're riding or on the tread. That sidewall for some reason just usually is like the first thing to go, or at least where you see most of the wear. So you sometimes can see cracks. You'll see big gashes on there if there was like an accident, or if you like tried to go through a pothole and maybe it hit the sidewall in a certain way. This is because, if you've got this like scratch on your sidewall or something that's crumbling, you can usually see threads on the inside. And then what happens if there's like something that would normally hold a lot of pressure now has been torn apart, that inner tube is going to try to work its way out because of the high pressure. So look at, and you have, 4 sidewalls, right? Each tire has 2 sides. Check the sidewall on both sides. Take your time. You can take your thumb and just like while you're turning the wheel, or just move your whole thumb around and make sure that there's no heavy cracking. You can see here in figure 1, it's just an all black tire, but it seems pretty consistent across the board where it's smooth. There are no cracks on there. Another way is to check the actual tread. Now, some tires are slick or smooth and don't have a lot of tread, but you can tell if it's uneven. If you've been riding on it a lot, you can tell that some of that tread is worn away, and you can see sometimes some threads or some metal on the inside of your tire that's poking through. And in figure 2, you can see some, cracking on the sidewall. If you, I can almost sense it here. If you were to sort of like take your fingernail or a little poker tool, you can have some of that stuff come off. And I immediately say, yeah, you might be able to ride like 10 to 100 miles. It's hard to say, but do you really want to be in the middle of nowhere getting a flat because the sidewall has been compromised and it caused a flat on there? So if you're able to get this replaced, but that figure 2 tire is pretty severe. There's sometimes where if it's just like the crackling that you see on that brown sidewall in figure 2, if it's just like that crackling, maybe you can get away with it, but just know like you don't have much time after that. Soon after, you're probably gonna have to replace that. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. You said that, and maybe you'll cover this later, but about having the right air pressure. How do we know that? Do you use a gauge, and what kind of gauge would we use? Thanks.
Yeah, cool. That is the next slide. So I hope this will answer. Oh no, I covered up one of I think that just says Presto or Schrader, which says it on figure 2 there. Yeah, so bicycle tires have more air pressure than car tires, right? So I know that there's these like gauges that if you put it on a car tire, I just started driving like a few years ago, so I don't know too much about cars, but I think I saw my dad once when I was a kid, like there's this metal thing and you put it on the valve of the tire and it pops out and it tells you where the pressure is. They make something similar like that for bikes, but I don't really like it. But so you want to check for air pressure specifications on that same sidewall we were just talking about. Sometimes it's printed on there, sometimes it's like embossed or like raised rubber, but I've seen some super, super old worn tires. What did I have? I had a bike from 1948 the other day, and the tires were so worn, they should have been changed decades ago, but somehow that writing and that pressure specification was still on there. So somewhere on there, and I would look on both sides. Sometimes it's not on one side of the sidewall, sometimes you got to look on the other side, but look on there, and it's typically measured in pounds per square inch, which is your PSI, or they just go by like a general bar gauge. So if you have a pump, there almost every foot floor pump should have a gauge on it, and it has both on an outer circle, it's usually the PSI, and then there's like an inner circle telling you like what 60 PSI is in the bar gauge. So I always tell folks to try and they give you a range. They'll say inflate this tire 45 to 65 psi. I always like to stay on the higher end of that, just to avoid those pinch flats that I was talking about earlier. So almost any floor pump will have a gauge on there, and as you're pumping it up, you'll see that needle move up slowly. It usually takes a few pumps to get it going up. There are some hand pumps, like smaller mini hand pumps, that have that. There's some what are these called? These like I just ordered one. An air compressor. Air compressors usually have a hose, and you can usually apply a gauge to it. If you don't have something that shows you a gauge, then try and acquire something that shows you. As I mentioned earlier, I was at a point where I was fixing and repairing bicycles out of my dorm room when I was younger, and it's not very reliable, but you want to go by feel. So that's one of the first things I do before I even check my gauge, is I just feel it. And it's a bicycle that I ride regularly, so I kind of know, what something's supposed to feel like. That's, if you don't have anything, go with that. But if you ever do get to a point where what 80 psi feels like. Just kind of get used to that feeling. I like to inflate the tires to that rated pressure on the sidewall. Again, don't go too high, don't go too low over that, or don't go low or high, over that recommended pressure at all. They do make tires that are super high pressure, and they do make tires that are lower pressure for a little bit of a softer feel. Usually those are thicker tires. Mountain or hybrid tires usually have that. And use that pressure gauge that's on the floor pump to ensure that pressure. And you want to make sure that you know what kind of valve you have. These are two different valves. There's a couple of others that I've only seen once in a photo. I've never seen in my bike shop. But in figure 1, you've got to press the valve. Usually this holds higher pressure. It's very narrow, and it has another part that there's a needle that you have to thread open. And I always like to test it first. So once you thread that little nub open, you test it to make sure that the valve is working properly. And then the one that most folks have seen is called a Schrader valve in figure 2. And that is the same valve that you'll see on a car tire. So just figure out which one it is you have. On floor pumps, especially if you buy something that's for consumers, they usually have a part for both valves. They'll have the thicker one for a Schrader and a more narrow one for Presta. There are some that they say you can use, the floor pump on either or. Sometimes you can only use one for the other. I have a different floor pump for each kind. It's the same pump. It's just I hate switching all the time. Did that answer your question about how do you know about the gauge and whatnot?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions that have come up about air pressure? Cool. Now we are on the B. So these are for brakes. Have a look at your brakes and your brake levers. They're different, right? I don't have these labeled, but the one to your left is the Shimano. It's a Shimano V brake on there. That's a brake lever. That's what you do your compressing on. They look different. Sometimes they're on drop bars for a road bike. Sometimes they're on the very ends of handlebars, but that's your brake lever. So take a look at your brakes, take a look at your brakes levers. The two options to the left, so in the middle, you've got the side pull road brakes, and on the right, you've got linear or V brakes. When you're pulling or you're tensioning on those levers, make sure that they react, right? What happens a lot when you get a bicycle you don't know or has been sitting around for a while, or even worse, it's been sitting outside in the elements. There's the cable that comes out of your lever is usually wrapped in something that's called housing. That housing is just black vinyl with metal on the inside. Sometimes there's another piece of plastic in there that allows that cable to go through. But even then, if it's been compromised or broken, it gets rusted and it does not allow that cable to move. So you might get a tiny squeeze when you're hitting those brake levers, but I should mention that I would say 99% of the time, right is rear and left is front. So your right brake lever is almost always going to be your rear brake. And your right shifter is almost always going to be your rear derailleur. So when you are compressing that right lever, sneak your eye to the back and see how that caliper or that brake is moving, right? So make sure that it reacts, that when it compresses onto your rim, that the brake pads go on to the rim. I also wrote on here disc rotors if you have disc brakes. It's a little bit harder to see, but you can sneak your eye into that caliper in the back and look at the brake. But you want to make sure that when you're doing something, it's reacting to where it's supposed to, right? So don't just go, oh yeah, this looks like it's squeezing, but sometimes it's rusted and it still lets you squeeze that it's still not doing anything in the back. So you want to use your eye and your feel for that. Notice if the pads spring back as well. You can kind of see, oh look, it's moving on the calipers in the middle there. I didn't know that, but there you are. I picked the right photo. See how they kind of clamp into the rim? They're compressing and then they open back up, and they both move. It's not just one, right? It looks like here one is moving more than the other, but they both should go in and they both should open back up when you release, and that allows your rim to pass through when you're not using your brake. Um, I also have on here, make sure that you're inspecting that housing and just follow it, sort of like play a little maze game and say, okay, here's my lever, and just trace that cable all the way to where it goes. Look for cracks, look for rust, look for any like parts of vinyl that have been torn up. Because if you're seeing that it's not moving, chances are something has corroded inside and it's not letting that cable be pulled for tension. Um, but if you have a crack and your brake is working properly, okay, maybe you've got a little bit of time left, but I would still say soon after that I would replace it, okay? And so if some of that housing is worn, or if you notice that like the levers aren't moving, this is where you get to decide, okay, this needs to go in because it's not stopping. And remember, stopping is probably the most important thing. I've had clients not in the past say, oh, you know what, don't worry about, and I don't know if they were trying to save money or just wanted to get their bike back quickly, but they were just like, don't worry about the brakes, I just want the chain to shift and I want to be able to ride. And I'm just like, something's going to come up, you're going to need to stop, this has to work properly, I can't work on this bicycle. Like, it's the most important thing to make sure that your brakes are working, whatever kind of brakes they could be, kickback brakes like we had when we were kids, when we're coaster brakes. As long as they work properly and they are doing what the bike is meant to do, that's what you should make sure that we're at that level of maintenance for your bicycle. Any questions about brakes, brake levers, cables, housing? I don't know if you can tell, but we haven't had to use any tools yet. So this is why I really like talking to people about this, because if you have to use a tool, you probably already have it in your toolbox, but you haven't had to use any tools yet. You're just kind of running checks and seeing kind of what moves and if it's moving properly, if it's releasing properly. So I don't think I get to tools for a little bit. So any questions? Okay. We have another brakes. You want to squeeze the brakes for tension, and while you're holding, so I would do it one first and then the other. I don't know if this has ever happened to anyone, but when you're using your brakes, and if you only use your left brake, which is your front brake, that usually kind of moves you forward a bit because that's your front brake. And when we're moving forward, that brake in front of us tends to have a little bit more like motion against us. So use both separately. Just be aware that when you test your rear brake for this test that I'm about to explain, sometimes the bike does move more than you would like it to, but just know that that's typically normal. So you'll do one, test it, the other, test it, and then you'll do both, because most folks brake with both hands. So that's your true test, is with both. But just know that sometimes if you're only doing the test on the rear, the bike will still move forward and not stop as much as you think you'd want it to, but just be aware of that. So you'll squeeze these brakes for tension and hold them. So we'll do let's say we just do the front, and you'll have this bike standing next to you, and you'll kind of try and attempt to push and roll it forward. And that's your first test, is my front brake working here on the left? And you'll do it again with the rear or the right brake, and you'll do that test again. And you'll kind of notice to see how easily the bike moves forward. And if the brakes are creating enough friction and enough tension on your rim or your disc brake to be able to stop it or slow it down. If you're doing a test, one, the other, or both, and you see that the wheel is just moving freely and no amount of compression or tension is helping, then that's another way to tell that something is up with your system, either your cable, your housing, or your lever, or even like the brake calipers themselves. Sometimes they're not properly adjusted. So this is like another fun, I think, easy way to be able to start thinking, okay, this is what this is going to be like when I'm on this bicycle. If this is moving forward and nothing's helping, I need to be able to do something else with this. Any questions before we move to the C? Okay. All right, so C is for chain. You want to make sure that the chain is clean and lubricated. A chain is just a bunch of links with some spacers in between that is constantly moving as you're pedaling, that's running on other components that are made of metal. And so lubrication helps minimize some of that wear when metal is rubbing on each other. Not only does it help with, you know, the durability and the longevity of the chain of your components, but it also works more efficiently because this chain is lubricated and because it's running more smoothly with other pieces of metal as it moves through your drivetrain. You'll be more efficient in your pedaling, you'll be more efficient in your shifting. So you want to make sure that it's clean and lubricated. And again, before, like if I got, sorry, again, I don't have figure 1, 2, and 3 here, but on the left here, if I got a bicycle with this chain that looks rusty and worn, you know, I still like to do a test. I check to see if the chain is stretched. I check to see how worn it is. I check to see if all the links kind of move as I, you know, turn it through the drivetrain. And then I just use a little bit of elbow grease. Like, this says to me this bike has been neglected more than once, especially because of that really white calciated ring in the middle or portion in the middle. But I still attempt to clean it. So this might be a little bit harder to do if the bike is sitting on the floor, but if you can flip it upside down, or sometimes I don't put it on the stand, I just clean the portion that I can reach on the top. And if you can see here in figure 3, the one furthest to the right, there's a portion on the chain on top and a portion on the chain on bottom. And without moving any pedals or any gears or anything, you just grab a rag and just kind of move it back and forth, trying to see how much of that stuff gets off. You do that same thing on the bottom. Just be careful with your knuckles. Make sure they don't get too close to the teeth. You don't even have to do the full portion, because then you're going to rotate your chain around and do the rest of it. So you can just do it bit by bit. And lubrication, you can use really any chain lubricant that's out there. Just apply it regularly, especially like if you do a really dusty, you know, sandy ride. Having some lube on there just keeps it nice and healthy. Chains aren't expensive, you know, they're like $20 to get it replaced. But if you go too long without having it replaced, this chain will wear out the rest of your components. And that's when it can get pretty pricey to have to change your cassette or your freewheel, to have to change, you know, the pulleys on your derailleur or your front chain wheels. So keeping a chain nice and lubricated is like the first thing. So a rusty chain drags, as I mentioned, you know, makes it less efficient. It changes gears poorly. And if it's like rusty, it may even snap, which is the worst thing. You don't want that to happen while you're riding. So while you're down there, like spin your pedals and check that the cranks don't wiggle also. The cranks are in figure 3, the one furthest to the right. There's something called and I don't know if everybody uses this in the, you know, bike shop mechanic world, but there's something called play. You know, you want bearings to move smoothly. So there's bearings in a bottom bracket, which is where your crankset is, but you don't want something that's called play. So if something is too loose, there's movement in a direction that you don't want it to be, right? So we want our crank and our bottom bracket and our pedals to move smoothly in this direction. But as you can see here in figure 3, there's an arm, a crank arm down and a crank arm up. If you were to try and move them this way, laterally in a direction that you don't normally do, and if you can feel for play there, that means that there's some looseness. That's not something that you need to check too often. It's pretty rare, but it's something if you wanted to have some additional maintenance checks on your bicycle, it's good to see if there's play in there or not. In here, I wrote that it doesn't wiggle from side to side, that there aren't any grinding noises from the bottom bracket. That's also pretty hard to hear if it's just on the crankset, but it's good to kind of get down there and sort of see what's happening in your drivetrain. Any questions about chains?
Yeah, I've got
Yeah,
Good lubricant, like 3-in-1 oil or graphite, or what do you recommend?
There's all sorts of things. I mean, there's
is
like
WD-40 a good one?
is that a serious question?
Yeah,
Okay. There's some chemicals in WD-40 that tend to create so that stuff doesn't get used up like chain lube does. So it stays behind, and it not only does it cake up, but it attracts a ton of dirt and dust. So if you apply regularly like WD-40, it's just piling on, and on top of it attracting a lot of dust and dirt. They do make a WD-44 bike chain. So if you're gonna go with that route, make sure that you have the one that's for bike chains. I prefer really thin dry lube. So they make dry and wet lubes. One of them is good sort of like all around, and you don't have to apply that often, but it's a little bit thicker. It's something that I use for my bikes because I'm not a professional rider and I don't ride as much, or I don't ride seriously, or I don't think that's somewhere where I think my efficiency is needed. So I tend to like dry lubes. And then there's some that dry up as a wax and last a little bit longer. It really just depends. I think across the board, as long as you find something that is specifically for bike chains that will eventually get worn away, that's what you want it to do. Is you don't want something to last too long. So when you apply lube, and I take my time, I apply, make sure that it lands on every link, and I turn the chain, do it again, make sure it lands on every link. You want to wipe some of that excess away, just like the WD-40 that stays there. Like a chain lube, you also want to just make sure that goes away, because you want it to get into the insides of the links, a little bit on the outside, and eventually it starts spreading through the rest of your drivetrain, right? So your chain wheel up front, and your cassettes and freewheels in the back, and maybe your pulleys on your derailleur a little bit. So just stick to something that is specific to chains, that is going to wear properly as it's getting used.
Thank you.
Yeah. And here is the quick check of the ABC quick check. Not all bicycles have quick release skewers. This is where that 15 millimeter, sometimes it's 14, box wrench comes in, or adjustable wrench. But you want to ensure that these quick release skewers are adjusted and installed properly. Make sure that they're tight enough to keep the wheels on. So if you have a quick release, do that. And if it's a wrench, if they're like lock nuts, make sure that you have that wrench in hand to be able to tighten them as much as they need to go on. A quick release skewer, I probably should add a picture over here on it, but it has a lever, and it's usually on the left side of your bike, or the non-drive side where there's nothing on that side of your bicycle. That lever just kind of opens up to be able to release your wheel from there. So just make sure that that lever is on there properly. And then your check is take a quick ride before you go on your actual ride, go around the block, go around the park. Make sure that the derailleurs and the brakes are working properly after they've passed these tests that you can do before riding it. And then just generally inspect for broken parts or loose parts. A lot of the times, like there's a bunch of loose things on handlebars because everybody at some point had like a computer adapter on there, a bell, a reflector. You don't want those things dangling in your way when you're riding. It's not a huge, thing to think about, but I don't like things jiggling on my bicycle if I didn't put it there. So it's good to tighten it, remove them or fix them or whatever else you need to do, but just kind of like pay attention to those sounds as you're doing that test ride. And that's it.